In my previous life, I was stuck in a suffocating cycle, bound to Ethan Jong, my fiancé. From the outside, everything appeared perfect, but behind closed doors, I was trapped. I did everything expected of me, cooking, cleaning, supporting his career, but all the while my heart ached because the love I gave was never returned. I watched helplessly as Ethan remained emotionally distant, often preoccupied with his career, and more often than not, with Lucy Snow. Even our children, in their own subtle way, began to notice. They told me, on more than one occasion, that it would be better if I let Ethan go, so he could finally be with Lucy. They even suggested it was for his own good, and for theirs too. They were right, of course. I had been living in the past, fighting for a relationship that was already dead. When I died, alone in my bed after a fight with my son about divorcing Ethan, I regretted everything. I wished I had taken control of my life much earlier, not allowing Ethan and the past to dictate my every choice. But just as the regrets overwhelmed me, I was granted a second chance, a chance to rewrite my story. I was reborn before Ethan and I ever got married. This time, I promised myself that I would do everything differently. I wasn't going to waste another lifetime waiting on someone who wasn't truly mine. The first thing I did was apply to the Northwest Institute of Technology, far away from the city and Ethan. It wasn't just to get away from him, but also to escape the suffocating weight of the life I had lived before. Ethan stayed behind at the university, and I seized the opportunity to build a future for myself, one that didn't revolve around his every move. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't help but notice the subtle parallels to my past life. Ethan and Lucy came over, just like before. They arrived with that same air of superiority, thinking I would welcome them. The moment they stepped into my apartment, Lucy, in her usual fashionable attire, gave me that familiar sweet smile. It was a smile that had never once been for me, but always for Ethan. The child, who had grown used to this routine, dashed to serve food, one bowl for herself, one for Ethan, and one for Lucy. None for me. I stood in the background, watching them chat like a perfect family, while I was nothing more than a bystander. But this time, I wasn't going to play the role of the dutiful wife who accepted it. I prepared the food, but when they tasted it, it was too salty. Lucy, looking disgusted, muttered, "It's so salty, it's inedible." She barely managed to force a smile and then whispered, "I guess your cooking just doesn't suit our tastes." And that was the moment I snapped. The bitter taste of their disdain lingered in my mouth, but I held my ground. Ethan scrambled to make things right, offering soup, but even that was ruined, just like everything else in our life together. They left, with Lucy in tow, taking their child and leaving me to clean up the mess. But I wasn't upset anymore. I had learned my lesson. I was done trying to please them. Instead, I turned my attention to the future I was about to build. I began packing. The furniture, the belongings, the memories. It was all part of a past I was leaving behind. As I sorted through my things, I came across the embroidered bedding I had worked on in secret for years. It was a small but personal achievement, something I had done for myself in the midst of all the chaos. But now it was just another reminder of wasted time. I sold it at a pawn shop for 30 yuan. It wasn't much, but every penny would help me as I pursued my future. I also found my university acceptance letter hidden in the drawer. It was my ticket to freedom. The excitement of a new life rushed through me as I marked the date on the calendar, just a few more days. In 20 days, I would leave everything behind and start anew. But Ethan wasn't oblivious. He returned late that night, and as usual, he had that faint trace of white tea perfume on him. I knew immediately that he hadn't been at school as he claimed. He had been with Lucy, as always. It was the same story, repeated endlessly, and yet I had always been the one to swallow my hurt and pretend it didn't matter. Not anymore. The next morning, he prepared breakfast, something he had never done before. He made fried eggs and ate treasure porridge, trying to make things right. But it felt hollow. It was too late for such gestures. I sat at the table, my hands trembling as I stared at the food he had prepared. "I'll take a leave of absence and go back with you," Ethan suddenly offered. His words were unexpected, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But then I realized it was just another manipulation. He didn't want to lose control over me. He was trying to keep me close, but I wasn't going to fall for it this time. As he left for work, I continued packing. I wasn't going to let anything tie me to this place. I had already sold my textbooks, my notes, everything that reminded me of my past life. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to get me started on my new journey. That night, I finally did what I had been avoiding for years. I formally broke the engagement. The elders in the village, who had always treated me as family, were hesitant at first. They tried to reason with me, telling me that Ethan was a good match and that I was making a mistake. But I had seen enough. I wasn't going to let my life be dictated by tradition and obligation anymore. I was ready to let go. The elders finally relented and issued a certificate nullifying the engagement. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The weight of years of unspoken expectations lifted from my shoulders. I was free. As I left the village to head to the Northwest Institute of Technology, I felt a mixture of sadness and excitement. I had made the right choice, but I didn't look back. I was walking toward my future, and nothing would stop me now. When I returned to Ethan's apartment to gather the last of my things, I knew I was done. He had Lucy and her daughter with him again, but it didn't matter. I had already broken free. I marked the calendar one last time, just 4 days to go. In 4 days, my life would change forever. This time, I wouldn't be the one left behind. I was walking away, and nothing was going to pull me back. "So what did your family say?" Ethan asked, his gaze sharp as he awaited my response. I hesitated briefly, swallowing the frustration that built up in my throat. "They had someone check the dates, and the 9th isn't a good time. We'll have to discuss it later," I said, offering an excuse I had rehearsed with the Leong elders to buy myself more time. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about escaping, about taking back the reins of my own life. Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Looks like I'll have to pick a new date," he muttered, his voice distracted as he turned to leave the room. "I'll make dinner. You should rest." I sat down by the desk by the window, my eyes landing on the marriage report Ethan had been filling out. The only thing left was the date. I lingered on it for a moment, my fingers curling into fists as I tried to steady my thoughts. The weight of the decision ahead was suffocating, but it was necessary. I wasn't going to let this marriage, this life that had consumed me, define me any longer. Pulling myself together, I got up to help him. As I made my way to the kitchen, I overheard voices. Ethan's deep voice, Lucy's playful tone, and Yin Yan's bright chatter. It was clear that I no longer belonged in this house. With only 4 days left before I would break free from this life, sharing space with Ethan was no longer an option. But the timing was too tight to find somewhere else to stay. After dinner, I decided I'd set up a makeshift bed in the living room. The day had been exhausting, and I had hoped for a peaceful night's sleep, but Lucy's energy was overwhelming. Dressed in a white dress, she practiced dance moves on the floor, stretching with an intensity that felt like a mockery. Meanwhile, Yin Yan, ever energetic, ran in and out of Ethan's room, bouncing on his bed like it was some kind of playground. The air felt thick with tension, and I could barely breathe in the same room as them. I grabbed a basin, desperate for a moment of peace, and went outside to fetch water. As soon as I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cool night air, trying to calm the storm inside me. "Aru, you're back! Weren't you staying with your in-laws?" Mrs. Hu, the neighbour, greeted me warmly, carrying her own basin as we made our way toward the well. "I went for a few days and just returned," I replied, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Hu, whose husband worked as an accountant at the mines, had always been kind to me, often bringing homemade treats. We had a good relationship, and I appreciated her friendship, even if it was based on polite, surface-level exchanges. I have to say... Mrs. Hu's voice dropped, and she leaned closer, glancing behind us before pulling me away from the well. She tapped my forehead gently, but with an almost scolding tone. "You're too soft-hearted. That woman, her husband is gone, and she's flaunting herself all over town. Why would you let someone like her into your home? Ethan is a catch, like honey attracting flies, and you just invite trouble right in." Her words, though harsh, held a grain of truth. "That man even told people it was your idea to bring Lucy and her daughter here because you felt sorry for them. Can you believe it? He's using you as a shield so others won't gossip about him." Mrs. Hughes' voice was tinged with a mix of sympathy and frustration. I smiled bitterly. Of course Ethan would say that. He didn't want anyone to think badly of him, so he placed the blame on me, pretending to be the martyr in this situation. "I know," I whispered, "but with so little time left, I don't want to waste energy arguing." Mrs. Hughes sighed, but there was determination in her tone. "You need to get rid of her as soon as possible, and if you need help, just let me know. Don't be shy." Although I sensed her curiosity, I appreciated her concern. I could tell she saw through Ethan's manipulations. When I returned to the apartment, the living room was finally empty. I quickly grabbed some clothes and went to the bathroom, only to find it occupied with unfamiliar women's toiletries. My towels and shampoo had been shoved into a corner next to the trash can. In their place were Lucy's things: 2 towels, shampoo, and a hairband. I felt a surge of anger. "Auntie, Yin Yan needs to use the bathroom. Can you move?" Lucy's voice broke through the silence. She brushed past me, deliberately bumping my shoulder, and I hit the doorframe with a thud. Lucy was already crouched down, helping Yin Yan with her business. "Sister-in-law, could you please move? You're blocking the way," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false politeness. But the smugness and disdain in her eyes were unmistakable. I didn't budge. "Apologize," I said calmly, my voice steady but firm. Lucy froze, clearly not expecting me to stand my ground. Yin Yan, ever the protective daughter, rushed forward and shoved me, her wails filling the room. "You're bad! You're bad! You bullied my mummy! You're a bad person!" Ethan came rushing out of his room, alarmed by the noise. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Lucy, her eyes welling with fake tears, explained, "It's my fault. Yin Yan had to go urgently, and since sister-in-law was in the bathroom, I asked her to step aside. That's all." Ethan glanced at me disapprovingly, though he didn't speak further. He comforted Yin Yan in his usual soft, indulgent way. "Don't cry! Don't cry! How about we ask Auntie to apologize, When Yin Yan continued to cry, Ethan picked her up and carried her back to the room, promising her candy to calm her down. Lucy threw me a triumphant smirk as she followed them out. The sound of Yin Yan's sobs slowly faded as they disappeared into the room. I stood there, numb, as I finished washing up. I gathered my things slowly, carefully placing my college acceptance letter in my bag. I was determined to leave, to be free from this suffocating situation. As I returned to my room, I saw the colourful box of candies on the nightstand, clearly meant for Yin Yan. Ethan looked at me and paused. "Let's talk," he said, his tone controlled, but I could see the concern behind his words. Judging by his expression, I knew what was coming. He wanted to lecture me, tell me to act like an adult, to not stoop to a child's level, and most likely to tell me to apologize. I sat down without saying anything, taking a piece of paper and dabbing it against the small wound on my forehead where I had hit the doorframe. Then I held it out to him. The smear of blood was stark against the white paper. Ethan's words caught in his throat. His face turned pale, then flushed. "I'll sleep in the living room tonight," I said, getting up and grabbing some bedding. "Wait!" Ethan grabbed my arm. "You can sleep in here. Why are you going out there?" He assumed I was angry about what had just happened. With a sigh, he tried to explain. "Yin Yan is just a child, and Lucy didn't mean any harm. You're an adult. Don't hold grudges against a child. There are guests. I know you don't like Lucy, but she's had a tough time. Don't be petty, okay?" I let out a cold laugh. "So you brought her back here and told everyone it was my idea, right?" Ethan froze, his breath hitching. He opened his mouth but said nothing. I shook my head, smiling bitterly. No matter how noble his excuses sounded, his true intentions were clear. That night, Ethan ended up sleeping on the living room floor. The next morning, I packed my belongings, ready to leave. I had booked a cheap hotel just down the street, a small room for 3 days. After grabbing breakfast at a nearby stall, I returned to collect my luggage, but when I opened the door, I found my carefully packed items scattered across the table. Yin Yan was playing with my college acceptance letter, folding it into a paper airplane. My heart sank. "What are you doing?" I shouted, snatching the letter from her hands. Yin Yan fell off the chair, wailing at the top of her lungs. Lucy rushed in. "What are you doing?" Who gave you the right to bully Yin Yan? She demanded, pushing me aside and scooping the child into her arms. My anger boiled over as I carefully unfolded the crumpled letter, making sure it wasn't damaged. Bully her? Why don't you look at what she's done? I said, voice trembling with fury. Who told you to touch my things? Get out of here. Lucy stood, holding Yin Yan, and sneered. You're not even married to Ethan yet. This isn't your house to order us around. With that, she walked toward the door, but stopped to add, Even if you do marry him, you'll never win against me. The door slammed shut behind her. Lucy's hostility always came out when Ethan wasn't around. In the past, I had been insecure and timid, believing that I could never compete with her beauty and talent. But now, having been reborn, I realized there was no need to fight for Ethan's affection. In Ethan's heart, Lucy would always be number one, but I had a second chance, a chance to make my own path, and that didn't include him. I marked the calendar again, counting down the days, just 4 days left. This time, I would finally be free. This afternoon, your daughter was rummaging through my things, I said, my voice low, barely holding back the anger that had built up inside me. When I told her to stop, your precious Sarah said I had no right to tell her off. She even went as far as to say that even if I married you, I wouldn't be able to compete with her. Ethan's expression darkened, his face flushing with a mix of confusion and frustration. What? My daughter? She's just my goddaughter. I ignored his outburst and continued, my words sharp like a knife cutting through the air. You use the excuse of taking care of a comrade's widow to get close to her, but if your late comrade knew how you've been taking care of his wife, do you really think he'd rest in peace? My words hit their mark, piercing through the carefully constructed facade he had built around himself. His face paled, and he staggered back a step, stunned by the force of my accusation. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity, until finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. Fine, he said, his shoulders slumping. If you're not coming back, stay here and reflect. I'll come back for you in a few days. He turned and left in a hurry, muttering, I never wanted to wrong you. I'll go back and file the marriage report now. I shut the door quietly, the hollow sound echoing in the small apartment. How ridiculous! In his eyes, agreeing to marry me had been some grand favour for which I should be eternally grateful. I wasn't going to play that role anymore. The next day, I went to my teacher's office to pick up my train ticket, anxious that I might not get a seat. My teacher had gone out of their way to arrange everything for me, even contacting some acquaintances in the northwest to make sure I had a place to stay. After sharing a warm lunch, I purchased local specialties as gifts for my future roommates, hoping to make a good impression. On the last night before I left, I tried to prepare myself for the emotional weight of it all. I thought I would be restless, filled with anxiety about what was to come, but surprisingly, I fell asleep almost immediately, my exhaustion finally catching up with me. The next morning, I handed the letter for Ethan to the hotel front desk, checked out, and headed to the train station with my luggage. The 2-day journey was bumpy, and I could barely catch any sleep. When I finally arrived at the university, the overwhelming sense of relief was palpable. It was a new beginning. After completing the registration process, I threw myself into my coursework. Having never had the opportunity to attend college in my previous life, I cherished every moment. I was determined to make up for the time I had lost. Outside of eating and sleeping, my life consisted of class and library sessions. Every day felt like a fresh start, a chance to build something of my own. 3 months into my studies, the first letter from Ethan arrived. I wasn't surprised. He had found me. My teacher had already mentioned that Ethan had come looking for me, asking about my whereabouts. So when I saw his handwriting on the envelope, my heart didn't race as I had expected. I had already prepared myself for this moment. In his letter, Ethan said he didn't agree to dissolve our engagement. He confessed that in his heart, I had always been his wife. He denied any relationship with Sarah, saying he had already sent her away and would never see her again. He promised he would wait for me to return. Enclosed was 100 yuan, a sum I had no need for, and certainly no desire to accept. I put the letter away without responding, and I left the money untouched. The demands of university kept me busy, and I had little time to think about Ethan or his letters. Despite being at the top of my class and receiving scholarships, my monthly living expenses still weighed heavily on me. I had considered finding a part-time job, but when my teacher heard about this, he scolded me and insisted on sending me 50 yuan each month. In his letter, he made it clear that the money was a loan, and he cheekily added, "Don't worry, my wife knows about this and supports it wholeheartedly." For some reason, tears began to fall, something I hadn't done in my past life. I had shed tears of regret and sorrow then, but never like this. In this life, I had always been composed, controlling my emotions, but now, as I read those words, the floodgates opened. The tears came freely, soaking my pillow as I cried uncontrollably. My roommates rushed to comfort me, unsure of what to say, but I appreciated their concern. After that release, I redoubled my efforts. Ethan's letters continued to arrive every month, always with 100 yuan enclosed. His words became more desperate, his tone more pleading. In the final month of the semester, his letter admitted that he didn't think I would ever come back. Still, he promised to visit me and spend the new year together. But the visit never came, and the letters abruptly stopped. Later, I learned from my teacher that Ethan had married Sarah Snow. My teacher's letter detailed the turmoil Ethan had faced. He had originally applied for a transfer to join me, but his relationship with Sarah had been reported by someone. Since I was gone and unavailable as a witness, the case was suppressed, but Sarah lost her job because of the scandal. Faced with the consequences of his actions, Ethan had no choice but to marry her. My teacher's words were heavy with meaning. In hindsight, you are incredibly fortunate. You avoided what could have been a lifetime of misery. I knew I was lucky to have been reborn, to have escaped the trap that had once ensnared me. A year later, I received another letter from Ethan. The first line read, "I'm sorry." He admitted that Sarah had been the one to report him. When he refused her pleas to stay, she had taken matters into her own hands, creating a scandal that forced them to marry. As I read his words, I smiled bitterly. Ethan's realization came too late. I burned all his letters without a second thought. As for the money he had sent me, I returned every penny to my teacher, asking him to forward it back to Ethan. 2 years later, before graduation, I joined the National Infrastructure Project, dedicating myself to my country. My life now had purpose beyond the heartache of my past. Ethan Jong's life, on the other hand, continued to unravel. Ethan's epilogue. That night in the hotel, after hearing Aru's words, I locked myself away in my house for 3 days. The reality of my failure hit me like a ton of bricks. I had made a grave mistake, not in waiting for her to grow up, but in letting my heart stray. I had been so caught up in helping Sarah Snow that I had completely neglected the woman I had once promised to marry. Lucy's kindness, Yin Yan's innocent cheerfulness, they had distracted me from the fact that I already had a fiancé. After 3 days of isolation, I made up my mind. I couldn't lose Aru. I went to the hotel to find her, but I was too late. She had already vanished. I asked around, but no one knew where she had gone. It wasn't until I spoke with her teacher that I found out she had gone to the northwest. I returned home and saw the silver bracelet in her bag, the one we had exchanged as children, the symbol of our betrothal. By then, it was already too late. Her family had annulled the engagement. That night, I drank heavily, trying to drown the guilt that consumed me. Sarah came into the room, saw my transfer application, and caused a scene. The following days were full of arguments and confrontations. I had no choice but to marry her. My friends began to distance themselves, and the weight of my decisions pressed on me more than ever. Life with Sarah was suffocating. She kept a tight grip on me, and I could see the resentment in her eyes whenever I spoke of Aru. She wanted another child, but we never conceived again. Our daughter, Yin Yan, grew up, married, and had children, but her life was filled with turmoil. Her husband was abusive, unfaithful, and a gambler. Sarah spent her days crying over Yin Yan's struggles, but when Yin Yan wanted a divorce, Sarah opposed it. The years passed in misery. I had failed Aru, and now I was failing my own daughter. When Yin Yan eventually tried to escape her abusive husband, she was caught and beaten. She took her own life, leaving behind a 6-year-old child. As I looked at Yin Yan's son, I couldn't help but think back to a time when my life had been full of possibilities. If I had chosen differently, if I had never been drawn into Sarah's web, would things have turned out differently? Would I have been happier? But I couldn't answer those questions. The moment Aru left, I lost her forever. And as the years passed, I realized just how empty my life had become.